I think a lot of women are good at what they're doing. I think what they're maybe not good at is they're not very good at promoting themselves, right? You don't ask, you don't get, right? So I always I think, many people they're doing the job really well, they're keeping their heads down, and these people make great employees, right? But in order for them to sort of move upwards, right, they need to demand a seat at the table as well, right? I think a lot of women need to overcome perfectionism, right? So I think women are often growing up, this goes back to societal pressure again, right? Women and girls are sort of rewarded for being perfect or to adhering to rules, right? I remember at the time I just started my career, there was some challenge that I really just couldn't solve, and I was just oh, I'm doing such a terrible job, and I have I don't know if I'm the right person for this job. And then one of my friends told me, it's interesting. She told me, look, what you should be telling yourself is, if I do it, it's still significantly better than if nobody else does it. The way women are promoted, and a big part of that is also men promoting women, right? I think that's sometimes where women go wrong. They're looking for female role models, they're looking for female champions, and so on. There's fewer out there, and you'll limit yourself to that if you're just looking for female champions and female sort of people who help you, right? Just because there are more men at the top right now, so you need to look for sort of men who will also champion you.
Welcome, Bao-Y, to our series. In this, we talk about why there is lesser women representation at the top, especially in the world of investing, and why do we have so much of lesser capital availability for women founders. And who better than yourself to speak on it, because you yourself are a women investor and you've been investing across Europe and Israel in a lot of women founders as well. So wanted to know that what is your investment thesis looking like, and how much of capital allocation do you put in for women founders, and why is it that we see that moving very slowly and not something very rapidly when it comes to women investing into women businesses?
Yeah. So let me maybe start with sort of an intro and what I do, right? So I'm a venture growth investor at Target Global. So we manage 3 billion euros asset under management. Our investment mandate is to invest across Europe and Israel. And then I invest. So as a venture growth investor, I typically invest at the series A and B. So it means I and sometimes C as well, sort of depending on what the letter actually defines. But typically, companies that I invest into have at least sort of 5 million of revenues already. They're growing fast, and I would write sort of between 10 to 20 million euro of investment as a first ticket into companies. I From a sector perspective, I've sort of backed company in both the software space and the consumer space. And I think in consumer, it's been mainly, consumer subscription, right? I think to your question on sort of, backing, female founders, obviously sort of as, venture and growth investors, we always a little bit dependent on what, because we sort of invest into companies that have 5 million of revenues already, right? So it's less of a factor of, are you female or are you male, or do I believe in your story? Because there's obviously sort of the numbers that also partly speak for you, right? So we're obviously dependent on, the earlier stages, sort of having backed female founders before, and then obviously these female founders being successful so that they come to my stage, right? When I speak about female founders, it's not only sort of, female CEOs, but also sort of female co-founders, right? So there's, I don't know, chief product officer and so on. And you're right, there's very few, female founders. We've been fortunate that we've actually backed a few female founders in almost every fund, right? So in this current fund that I'm investing out of, we've backed a company called Lily out of Israel, which is a bank for sort of freelancers. So it's a fintech company. And there we have a female founder and CEO. It's not me who backed it, it's my one of my partners here. But yeah, there's very few. I think if I think about how many female founders at my stage, right, that are sort of sweet spot, have reached or getting close to 5 million of revenues, there's only a handful or so, right? There's very few.
Yeah, and why is that the reason? Is there something that is stopping the capital to go to women founders?
So I mean, I can only speak for really my stage, right? So what's stopping it is obviously, first of all, there's there's fewer female founders being backed at the earlier stages already, right? So if you look at sort of the split, And then from there, it's then, the criteria is then how successful is your business, right? So it's less to do with sort of your gender. So obviously you sort of starting with like, a smaller top of the funnel, and then there's always a conversion rate of who's actually successful and kind of grows into the stage where, they're being backed, right? Um, I think a couple of observations that I, can share with sort of, amongst this, right? So obviously, many of the technically, these teams could be a lot more mixed, right? Like a lot of like founding teams today are still very like, two, three co-founders, and both of them are male, right? So I think it's already starting with sort of who do you start a business with? Very few businesses actually starting a business by themselves, right? And I think for every structural change, it always takes time, right? So I think the structural change sort of, I think that sort of, initially there was like, fewer women in like STEM in the first place, right? So I'm not saying they're all technical founders. Most of the founders, are sort of, at least one or two of them are non-technical, right? So, but I think it's already starting off from there. Um, and I think at the earlier stages of sort of investing, right, a lot of it is very network driven, right? So you sort of find your first angel who's backing you, and that angel works hard for you and sort of knows other angels, and then these other angels are investing. And then I think it's still sort of access and working their network, right? So for a lot of these sort of, I think female founders at the earlier stages, right, they don't already have access to like this one person who is like the accelerator, right? So with networks, it's like if you find that right person who's sort of this accelerator for you, things are going to be easier from there. And then obviously from there, it's also so the conversion of where where you're going into. Actually, sorry, in this fund we've backed two female founders already, so it's actually pretty high. So there's another software company also out of Israel, uh, which is interesting because if you then think about many more of the female founders that we see, uh, there's more coming out of Israel than Europe, even though Europe is like much bigger. But we actually have two female founders that we've backed in this funds. They both came out of Israel.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you the question that which region do you see more female founders from? But it's good to
Yeah,
know that you have it from Israel, because that's like an innovation hub, where you find most of the technical aspects stemming from. And usually females don't prefer to go into that segment, but it's good to know that you have more from there. But what kind of businesses do you see females coming in from? Because they're more led towards impact driven businesses rather than just high cash burning tech led business.
yeah, it depends. I think it's interestingly the female founders that we have back, right, come from like not typical, or they're operating in spaces that are not very typical for women. So they're more in like male dominant industries. So we've backed, I think from our early stage fund, we've backed a founder in the insure tech space. So it's selling like software into insurance companies, which is obviously like a very kind of, if you look at like the female rate is probably quite low. And then we've backed, a female founder in the fintech space, which is also, very few female founders in the fintech space in the first place, right? And then we've backed, a female founder who's in the software space. So there's software for diversity recruitment, right? So which is obviously sort of a topic that has to do with sort of being female as well. But software is also, you find like, not that many women in software, right? I think if you sort of look at the female founders that I have spoken to, they tend to be exactly in this sort of, in the software space. And I think you tend to find more sort of female founders at the earlier stages in health tech companies, sometimes in impact type companies, and also
Yeah.
in consumer companies, right? Sort of like consumer tech. But the majority of like the VC investments is not going into these spaces, right? So it's also then about, if you want to be this type of VC backed business, being strategic about, what are some of the areas that you want to go into.
But have you ever, come across any studies which shows as to why women don't want to step into a risky business? Is there some mentality behind that?
I don't think it has to do with like the risk of the business, right? I think it just has to do with like personal motivation, right? So let's say you would start a fintech business if you have worked in a fintech before, or if you've worked in a financial institution before, likely, right? And so if you look at like how many women sort of work in these kind of positions, say product within a financial institution, or how many women work within fintech, right? There's also already fewer, right? So if I look at sort of management team of, many of the companies that we talk to, right, you tend to sort of see more chief people officer, chief marketing officer, right, that are female, right? Very few chief technical officer, right? And so in these sort of type of fields, you often find more technical founders and so on, right? Or women that have sort of worked in this field for like a really long time. So it just already starts to do with like the makeup of, the field that the serving has like fewer women, in the first place, right? So yeah, I don't have like a study to hand, but that sort of, would be my thinking of why, they haven't, because if I wouldn't choose a business, I wouldn't start a business in like cybersecurity if I have never worked in like the space before, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. So so I think that sort of has to do with it as well.
Yeah, that sounds fair. But is there some reason that women don't prefer going into a tech-led role, or maybe investing for that matter? Like you said, we see a lot of product officers or marketing officers being women, which is their sweet spot. And I get it that it's a lifestyle choice that they want to make of working only 9 to 5, maybe, whereas in investing, you have to work longer hours, and not many women are ready for that. Is that the reason why we see lesser representation, or during promotion levels, something changes where men are preferred generally over women?
I don't think so. I think part of it is internalized as well, right? That from childhood on, if men are taking risks, if they're aggressive and so on, like not men because at that time they were boys, right? But they're sort of rewarded, and I think women are sort of not. So like society sort of doesn't sort of talk. I had this debate with my colleagues as well, right? Like society doesn't reward women for like taking risk or sort of going outside the streamline, right? So it's say if a boy sort of like climbs a tree and falls down, they were like, boys will be boys, right? But then I think there's a lot of sort of where it's internalized from society that, if a girl does it, it'd be like, oh, it's not for girls, right? Girls shouldn't be doing this and so on, right? So I think there's a little bit of like the way sort of kids are being brought up, right? Where sort of it's society's job as well to kind of change these type of, gender roles, right? So I don't think it has to do with sort of women not wanting to work hard. I know a lot of really hardworking women, they're just working hard for like somebody else, right? So and so I think it's less, I think it's less about that. I think and also maybe partly why we probably see maybe more sort of female founders out of Israel that we have back, right? I mean, obviously we sort of have an Israeli office, but we've also back men out of there, right? Is I think going to the army there sort of changes like the level field, right? I think sort of where everybody kind of works hand in hand. The army obviously is a great sort of founding ground for people, having a lot of responsibility like very on in their life, right? And also working in like very technical areas of like the military, right? So I think like everybody who goes in there has to do this. And I think sometimes it's harder for women sometimes to be given opportunities in their sort of career path, right? To be in this kind of, you always need to break through barriers, right? If you're the first chief product officer, if you're a chief technology officer, people think of somebody who looks different, right? And there's a lot of merit to sort of promote women into these roles, because what we have seen from companies is if you bring in female leadership into like a counter typical role, right? Let's say you have a female CTO, that person will attract other women in technical fields to be developers in their organization, right? So people are like, oh, we're trying to have like more diversity in our tech team and so on. Yeah, but if everybody else who works there is, white and male, right? Who do you think would want to go there, right? So I think it also has to do with sort of the way women are promoted. And a big part of that is also men promoting women, right? I think that's sometimes where women go wrong. They're looking for like female role models, they're looking for female champions and so on. There's fewer out there, and you'll limit yourself to like that if you're just looking for like female champions and like female sort of people who help you, right? Just because there are more men at the top right now. So you need to look for sort of men who will also champion you.
Yeah, that's true. But speaking of that, how has your journey been? What's your story like? Because not many reach to the position where you are due to different other reasons. But how was it for you to climb up the career trajectory in this field of investing?
Yeah, it's interesting because we were talking about sort of the value of having a champion and somebody who believes in you and somebody who promotes you into like a role that um maybe you're too junior for, or you don't have like the credits for, right? And I think it's not only for myself, and I'll speak about my personal journey in a moment, but for many women that I know that have sort of had a male champion, that was like, okay, I think you're ready for this. I'm going to take a shot at this, right? For you to be able to do this, even though you don't have like any of the credits to do this, right? So I started my journey originally. So I'm originally from Germany. I grew up in Germany. I didn't know what VC was at that time because where I'm from in Germany, it's sort of a town of 300,000 people, right? So there's not a lot of touch points with like the tech world. And I really only came in touch with the tech, sort of with the VC world, when I moved to London and I studied here at Imperial. And I took a course at that time called Venture Capital. And we had people coming in and telling us about the jobs, the journeys, and a little bit what venture capital entails, right? And I found it super fascinating. And, at that time, I was like, oh, it's really interesting. It's something that I would definitely, want to do in the future as well. And before I joined venture, I worked for 3.5 years at Morgan Stanley. I worked at the investment banking division. And that also came about, interestingly, when I lived in Germany. I never really considered working in M&A or in the investment banking division, because it seemed like the kind of place where, all of the guys would go that would be like, oh yeah, like I work 100 hours per week. And, it was like very kind of macho kind of driven. And when I moved to London, I met this woman at a recruiting event. Actually, she was I think she was the European COO for Morgan Stanley Investment Banking, and I met her, and that actually really changed like the way I thought about that place. And I'm like, oh, maybe there is a place for women to be successful as well, and they're not all just kind of guys sort of you know um trying to how do I best phrase it, like publicly measure their dick, right? To be like, oh, I'm so great, I work so much and so on. I'm like, okay, I think I can do this. And I did an internship there, and I started my career there because at that time also there were no like analyst jobs into venture, right? It was a place where you build experience in another industry for a couple of years, and then you would go into venture. And so the first person who sort of believed in me, right, when I moved into venture, was the person who hired me into venture. And I didn't have any venture experience. I didn't have any venture network. I didn't have any venture experience. Um, and I think a big question, a big part of the job is to also originate, right? So meaning it's part a sales job as well, where you speak to founders and you connect with them and so on, right? So I have no track record of like any of that. And so the first person who actually hired me into my first job as an investor, as an associate, was also a guy called Ritis. And he hired me into like the first job. And I was sort of his number two on like, being associate and just going out there, sourcing, originating, and, sort of finding good deals, right? And it was interesting actually. So I think in his prior job, he also hired, a woman into like that first role, who was now incredibly successful in Europe as well as an investor. So he
So
definitely
how
sort
did
of
you get to that number two position, if I may, just before you
sorry.
go ahead? How did you get to that number two position in a short period of time? What kind of exposure did you get from your boss itself, who was a male, that you could explore everything that you wanted to?
No, sorry, I wasn't the number two. I was his number two. So I was like a lowly kind of associate, right? I was working on growth, like growth investing for like the very first time. So no, I wasn't the number two. I was just his number two. So
Yeah, but
usually,
how did that also happen? How many of y'all were there though?
yeah, there was just me. I was like the first person hired into it, right? So there was like number one and number two. So I was his number two. So
Got
there's
it.
nothing else. And for I think like the first 1.5 years, we worked pretty much in a pair, right? So I learned about a lot about, how should I look at investments and so on, how do I build my network. Um, and but it came from a position of I have never done this before, right? I think a lot of times when we hire these days, not we, I mean like as Target Global, but I think a lot of people hiring typically look at a track record already, right? They ideally want somebody to have had experience and exactly what they're looking for. I think if we sort of hire like that, it's very hard for us to hire for women or for diversity, because obviously if sort of you try to change the system, people haven't had experience in that before, right? So you need to take a leap of faith with people who have never done this before, right? And this person took a leap of faith with me. um and yeah, and then from there it's been, I've been doing this for the last 5 years now. Obviously been promoted a few times. I'm not an associate anymore, but um I think so that person actually left at some point and went on to like work for another fund. And then I've got my current boss right now, Yaron, right, who sort of took a leap of faith in me. At that time, I've been with the fund for maybe 2.5 years, and he took a leap of faith with me and said, I'm going to put you on the board of a company, right? And I've never had any other board experience before. And I think you're gonna do well. If you need me, I'll support you, but you're the person, right? And so that was like the second leap of faith. That's, again, it was like a male champion, right? Because at that, at that time and even now, right, there are no, I am the most senior female purse investor in this firm, right?
Wow.
Together with another colleague of mine, right? We're like two
Yeah.
investment directors. There are no more female. So you cannot look out for just like female role models because there are very few, right? So you need to be that role model for other people, right? And you sort of need to pave the way and sort of find people who will champion you regardless of gender, right? I think, actually learning from men sometimes can be, amazing because they have a very different perspective and they're more ingrained into sort of the what is now, right? So you also learn from them of like how to like navigate the system better. So this was the second person who took a leap of faith for me. I mean, I now sort of have 6, 7 board positions and so on from that. It's been, a great journey, but what it always requires is that first person, this one person to believe in you and says, you have no track record of doing this, but I think you're capable and you should do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds very interesting. But you also said that your bosses have been very supportive of you every time you were promoted from associate to now being the director. So if you could just talk about that in detail as to how did your promotion look like? Of course, on the work side of things, also you have to prove your mettle. So just wanted to understand how did you do that in an industry like this? Because our viewers are mostly some aspirational women who are wanting to get into the field and want to know how the promotional levels look like.
Yeah. Um, so let me say it like this. It's not like they were always supportive. Many times I was a push for it, right? So I think like the one piece of advice we give people is not to be too nice, right? If you're sort of waiting for people to acknowledge you and to sort of promote you onward, right? Like that's just not going to work, right? So you need to like negotiate sort of your position in a way, right? Like somebody once told me, you need to manage your career like a business, right? And that's the way you should be looking at it. You shouldn't be looking, like looking at it in like a very rational way. It's like if this is sort of my career, does this make sense? What have I achieved? What can I achieve? Right. And what's the value I add? Right. And so besides the very obvious that you should be good at what you're doing, but I think a lot of women are good at what they're doing. I think what they may be not good at is they're not very good at promoting themselves. Right. So there is a sort of piece of luck as well, right? Where you sort of come in like right time, right place. So coming in here, I saw that we were a firm that is growing. So when there is growth, there's always spots for like new people to sort of move upwards, right? If there's no growth, the only way for you to move upwards is to replace somebody else, right? So moving into like a place that it's growing, I think that's is one. And the other thing is you don't ask, you don't get, right? So I always sort of, I think, sort of many people are they're doing the job really well, they're keeping their heads down, and these people make great employees, right? But in order for them to sort of move upwards, right, they need to like demand a seat at the table as well, right? And they need to push. Um, and in a way, I think some people are afraid of breaking relationships if they push too hard. And I think culturally that's quite different as well, right? So it doesn't work across like sort of all cultures of the world. But speaking for sort of like the Western European sort of culture, right? You don't ask, you don't get, right? In a way, sometimes people respect you more if you stand up for yourself than if you just keep on doing what you're told, right? Then people are like, oh, they're doing a great job. I'll just give them more work. And, hopefully they can sort of stay in their position and forever because they're doing such a great job, right? But I think like the most important thing is also to ask and to acknowledge and to ask people to acknowledge what you've done, right? Because you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah, you mentioned a very important point that women, of course, sometimes don't feel like, talking about their achievements and talking about all that they've done, which
Yes.
hampers their growth so often. And sometimes they also feel that what if the questions I'm asking are stupid? And that's where the hesitation stems from. But did you also have something like this while you were growing up? If not, that's a really great thing, and I would love for you to tell our audience how did you not have it, and if you had, how did you overcome it?
So there's a few things. I think a lot of women need to like overcome perfectionism, right? So I think women are often like growing up, this goes back to like societal pressure again, right? Women and girls are sort of rewarded for being perfect or to adhering to rules, right? Oh, you're such a good girl. You're listening to your parents and you're doing everything, and that's great. And you're getting good grades and so on, right? But I think that sort of becoming comfortable with sort of being pushy and asking for things, right? I think that's like one, and seeing negotiations as something that is sort of fun and not something that has like, terrible downside, right? Most of the time it doesn't have terrible downside. It's like people say no, and then you haven't lost anything, right? So I think that's so overcoming perfectionism. And I remember at the time I was just starting my career, there was some challenge that I really just couldn't solve. And I was just like, oh, I'm doing such a terrible job. And, I have such a, I don't know if I'm the right person for this job. And then one of my friends told me, it's interesting because she doesn't even remember, but at that time it had this profound impact on me. She told me, look, what you should be telling yourself is if I do it, it's still significantly better than if nobody else does it. Right. So to not beat up yourself over if it's not perfect the first time around, if you don't know the answer the first time around, but just to be comfortable with like the progress and not like expect yourself to be like perfect from the beginning, right? That this is normal and to acknowledge that. I think that's one, right? To sort of overcome perfectionism. And the other thing is I heard this really great quote from Ellen Powell. So like the former, CEO of Reddit, right? And somebody asked her about imposter syndrome. They were like, oh, but did you ever, have imposter syndrome being like the CEO of Reddit, right? And she's like, no, I've met so many terrible CEOs, male CEOs in my life, right? Like, why should I have imposter? And I think that's the other thing is sometimes people hold, or women hold themselves to such a high standard. This goes again into like perfectionism that they feel imposter. But I think if they took a second and like looked around, right, and looked at how many people are actually doing a terrible job for the position that they're in, right, and then it's not about being perfect, right? It's about sort of doing your best and embracing the progress and keeping on going, and that this is a journey, right? So I think this is the other thing to remember as well.
Yeah, speaking of that imposter syndrome, have you noticed a difference in terms of female founders pitching you versus men? Because whenever male founders pitch, they speak of the bigger vision and they also speak of what they're doing currently. But females sometimes lose out on the bigger picture because they don't want to promise you something which they haven't done yet and only talk about what is there in their present. So how do you really assess female founders in that case?
Yeah. I haven't had that experience with female founders per se, because I think often when they come to me, right, they would have gone through like a few rounds of, like investment before, right? And they've sort of been polished in that way. And if they were not good at that, then they typically wouldn't come out to me. So I think that's maybe more applicable for the early stage. It's a flaw that I see sometimes across like founders in general, male and female founders, right? But I think where it definitely applies is the way that women negotiate, right? So many women are like, oh, I've done this, I've done that for the company. And all of that is great, but that's been in the past, right? Like people rarely reward for sort of past achievement, right? They want to know what you can do for them to help them achieve their goals, right? And so I think I took part in a negotiation workshop at some point, and that's been given to me as like a piece of advice, not to me personally, but to that group at that time, is that when you need to negotiate for future achievements, right? Because you need to sort of convince the other person that you can help them achieve their goals. And that's the way you sort of get what you want, right? Like the resources, the calm, and so on that you want. And that was a really good thing. And I've sort of been, sharing this advice ever since, because I think that's sort of it's a really important thing. I think for negotiation tactics, I've seen it less with founders though.
Got it. And one investment pitch that really caught your eye, but you said that it comes through different rounds and then you assess the founder. But one investment pitch that really has stuck with you so far, be it in Target Global or otherwise before,
From a female founder or in general?
in general.
Yeah, not maybe one specifically, but I think in principle, there's like a handful of sort of pitches that I have my top 10 list of. These are like the top 10 founders that I really liked, and why I really liked them, right? And to me, it has to do with how they understand questions. So I think sometimes, I had like a founder, and I liked, it was a guy, but I liked him very much. He came on the call, and he was like, what would you like to know? So I think sometimes people come on and they just like go off like the script of that they have, right? And they don't read the room and they don't read the audience, right? And I think like the founders who understand every question crystal clear, um, give a concise answer to it because they have thought about all of these questions before, right? So it tells me that they're very strategic. They've thought about like every angle of it and they made a decision. And it doesn't mean that they agree with what I'm asking, but it means that they have thought about this and they understand exactly why I'm asking it because they've been asking themselves the same question before, right? So those are like the founders that really stand out to me, where They come on, they're like super precise, they're super efficient, and they answer like they're speaking about all of these points that really matter. And I think that's really important because sometimes one of the big mistakes that founders are making is when they come on and they speak to investors the same way that they speak to clients. Clients do not, investors do not care about the same things as clients do, right? They would be like, we're talking about the product, this is what we're going to achieve, and so on. Like, nobody cares. As an investor, like in a way, my job is to generate returns for my investors, right? So the pitch is that you pitch me how you are going to, generate returns, right? And that is sort of through various different parameters than your clients would care about, right? So that's like, I think one of the biggest things is sort of differentiate how you talk to investors as opposed to how you're talking to customers, right? So, for example, investors would care much more about sort of the bigger vision, right? So maybe you're doing A today and you're doing B tomorrow that is adjacent to A, but really, what you want to talk about is also, K, right? Which is like super further down the road, but you convincing the investor that you have an endpoint of where you want to be, you see the journey, you're visionary, and you have put sort of very thoughtfully, you're putting A together, you're putting B exact together, you're putting C together, all of that for the end purpose of K. And obviously, as a customer, I don't care about any of that. I care about how can you help me today versus as an investor, I also care about like the sort of longer term, bigger vision. How is this super disruptive thing?
Got it. And what are some of the red flags that you look at in founders that you really can't, compromise on? What are some of those things that really piss you off as an investor when you
Yeah,
see happening in an investing company?
yeah. So obviously when we go through an investment process, we always challenge founders, right? We say, why are you not doing this? Why are you not doing that? Right. And one big red flag for me is if they immediately push back on everything that you say, right? Because it means that it's going to be very difficult to work with them. And they have a very specific way of going about it. And even if their ways sort of, maybe are not right or sort of proven to be wrong, they will continue doing that, right? So I don't want founders to always agree with me. I'm not looking for agreement, right? I'm looking for a discourse because this is sort of one of my founders said, and it's right. It's like board meetings sort of, the interesting conversations are always the edge case conversations, right? So I think the 90% where everybody agrees and so on, that's not interesting, right? Because you're not learning anything new and you're not sort of developing the business, right? The interesting parts is sort of on the left and right of like the discourse of where do people disagree and why, right? So to sort of find that, and that's kind of what helps the company grow and what helps people grow, right? And if founders don't, and I can see that founders don't want to have that kind of discourse, then it's not interesting because it means it would be very hard for them to grow and it would be really hard for them to sort of grow the business and have these conversations that will push them outside of their comfort zone and will push them to think differently.
Got it. And when we speak of your investments already in different portfolios, of course, like you mentioned, these also could be the reasons for a company failing. But apart from the founder, given the founder operations and everything in the team is going smooth, what is it really sometimes that really takes a U-turn and makes companies go down the drain?
Yeah. Go down the drain. Luckily, I haven't had a company go down the drain so far. But I think one of the key things, right, for founders sort of at my stage is they are transitioning from, it's always an ongoing journey, right? They're transitioning from doing many things themselves and knowing how to do things to being able to attract, hire the right people that can help them on their journey to be subject matter experts, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things, sort of making the right decisions on hiring and also retaining and motivating and getting the best out of the people that was going to help the business forward, right? In a way, I think as a founder, as a senior person, like everything you do is always, everybody should be replaceable in a way, including yourself, right? So you're looking to hire, bring on people who are smarter than you, and who can work, with you, right? And I think that's one of the things that founders don't manage to attract the right people and retain those people and motivate them and get the best out of them, right? Um, then it's really hard for them to do because then it's really hard to scale from like a certain stage onward.
Got it. And since you're an investor and you sit on the boards of many startups now, what are some of the things that you negotiate for in the term sheet that founders sometimes may not easily agree upon, but when convinced of the purpose as to why you're asking for it, they agree to it? What are some of those terms?
um that founders don't agree on that are, I mean, I think like usually, like the biggest sort of discussions are usually around voting rights, right? Like what are some of the areas that founders need approval for, and what are some of the areas that founders don't need approval for? Um, but those has to have more to do with sort of protecting, the capital for our investors, right? So like, oh, okay, if you're trying to raise, a next round, and it's at a down round or something, you would need our approval to do so, right? So it has less to do with sort of what's good for the company, but more to do with sort of what is sort of good, how do I protect my fiduciary responsibility towards my LPs, right? So those are some of the areas where, we're sort of talking about. I think, there's also like different areas in terms of, what's the structure of a deal, right? Like how do you structure it to make sense, right? So, but I think those disagreements typically happen on like sort of the, we need to do this because we need oversight as a fiduciary responsibility for our LPs, and founders obviously will want to have as much freedom to make decisions as they think is right, right? But obviously we sort of, on some of the areas, I think, on 99% of the areas we're obviously aligned, and then on 1% we're like, nope, you need our approval for this.
Yeah. Have you had any cases where you don't get a founder's consent for any of the terms? Have you had any such situation where it was very, very difficult to convince a founder?
No, I think it's not the founders. I think in the whole negotiation, there's the stakeholders are the founders, and then also the other investors, right?
Correct.
So most often with the founders, it's relatively easy to agree. I think sometimes with the other investors, they obviously have a fiduciary responsibility towards their LPs as well,
Yeah.
right? And so, but I think it's not a big issue for like closing in a way, right? I think we always try to obviously achieve the best for all of our for, I mean, at the end of the day, all of us want the company to be as successful as possible, right? Because that's the only way either of us is going to make money. I think obviously there's sort of it's more about sort of protecting the downside in case things don't go well, right? Like how do we sort of deal with that, right? And so it's more that, but it's not usually like a big sort of discourse in a way, right? I think during sort of the bull market, right, some of the founders were saying, oh, we want you to invest, but a very typical sort of standard term for investors that say it's Series B that come in is have one times liquidation preference, right? Meaning if the company sells and it sort of sells below the valuation that we enter, we will get our money back first, right? Which I think is fair because obviously investing at like a high evaluation, and at the minimum you should expect your money back if you're investing, right? Like that's like the worst downside case. And some founders were like, no, we didn't, and then we ended up not doing the deal, right? Because that's not a deal that we would underwrite.
Yeah. Speaking of the downside protection, do you also encourage founder re-ups in case the company performs really good?
Encourage what? Sorry.
Founder re-ups, which is the incentivization to founder by giving them more stake in the company.
Yeah, sometimes. So that has obviously happened with some of the founders, right? And it depends on sort of how much stake they have and what the sort of structure is and so on, right? But yeah, those things can happen as well sometimes.
Got it. And one of your portfolio companies is also imagindairy, which was like very, very unique product that I came across. If you could just explain it to our viewers as to how did you source that deal, I mean your team, and how did you end up investing into them? What was some of the parameters that you looked after?
Yeah. So I didn't actually work on that deal. So it was my colleagues. So I can only give you sort of on the periphery what they've done, right? But they've been looking into like the alternative meat, alternative milk and so market for some time. And I think there's obviously like sort of two approaches you can go about it. Either you're saying we believe this company is going to build a brand, a consumer brand, right? So similar to what Oatly and so has done. And I think for Imagine and sort of what my colleagues were looking at is a little bit more almost like into like the food sort of ingredient space, right? So saying, okay, you can actually recreate sort of milk, but you can make it lactose free. You can make it much cheaper. You can do it without sort of harming cows. And obviously there is a environmental impact not only from cows but also from like the gas and so on that cows produce, right? Onto like the whole like the way farming is done, right? And if you can biologically sort of recreate that, right, and make it much more affordable, environmentally friendly, and so on, then it would make sense, right? So from like sort of both angles, it would be cheaper to produce it, be environmentally more friendly. It's exact same molecular sort of molecular constellation, right? So and that's the way they looked at it, right? Obviously, it's a manufacturing sort of intensive company, right? So it's an R&D intensive company, but it has the potential to be, if it works out, it can be, sort of groundbreaking. It can be really big.
Yeah, yeah, it will be, because that was something that really caught my eye as soon as I looked after on the website. But what has really changed in terms of, getting deals while you were an associate and now? I just want to know the comparison, because it's very good to know the, growth trajectory as to how a person really develops in this market.
Yeah. I mean, it's in a way you can sort of think about it almost like a trajectory, like so you're starting out in a sales job and you're starting, you sort of become, you were more established, right? So initially nobody really knows you. You don't have a net, like I didn't have a network coming in, right? Like nobody really knew me. So it's very much about, building relationships with founders, with VCs, with other people in the ecosystem, right? Conference organizers and so on. So it was very manual in a way, right? So because you're going out there and you're like building all of this network, and so the inertia is obviously like, you're trying to run up the hill, right? And sort of, you need to like, it's a little bit like starting a car, right? Like there's an initial inertia that you have to overcome, and that you have to push through, and it's something where, a lot of people sort of are in the industry for like 2 years, and then they move out of the industry and so on, like, right? Like very few people actually sort of move upwards and so on, and stay there for a long time, right? And I think it's a lot about sort of overcoming that initial inertia and like really really wanting it, right? And also building a lot of goodwill in the market, right? So it's very much an ecosystem, so like giving to that ecosystem, it's very much about that, and sort of, and I think, it will then come back to you, and you will receive back from that ecosystem, and people will know you, and you will have a brand, and you will have done different things. But overcoming that inertia, and like initially, it takes a long time, right? And so people will have to be patient, and just keep on doing that and believing in like the process, right? Because it will not be immediate. And I think in VC specifically, there's a lot of like there's a lot of, you always see deals being done left and right and so on, right? But like to actually trust the process, and to keep on doing more of the right thing in a way.
Yeah, but when we speak of patience, it's a very subjective term. How much is that for you? How many years of patience do you require to build a good network in VC at least?
I remember when I first started, right? I'm like, oh, I don't know anyone. This is so hard. And somebody told me it takes you like at least 6 months to even know what you're doing, right? So don't expect yourself to kind of, you need to like gather enough information to be like, okay, I have an idea of what I'm doing, right? And then how you build the relationships, it's not about how long, right? It's about how you do it, right? It's a question also of, train for the Olympics, some people sort of train, smarter, and some people train less smart, right? So it's less about the timing, it's more about sort of how you go about it, right? That sort of makes all the difference. Like, who are you building relationships with? How are you building relationships, right? What value do you add to like, your relationships? And it's more about that. How do you connect with people? So all of the things that really come down to soft skills, right? Like some of the things that I know a lot of women are good at, right? But I think you just cannot be going in there and like acting very transactional. I think if you are, you will only build, a bunch of transactional relationships that don't really come through at the time in which you need them.
Yeah. I wouldn't go into the tips of relationship building because it will be different for every person. But
Yeah.
you also evaluate a lot of edtech companies, and that is a market which is considered to be very saturated right now. And many VC funds are not wanting to venture into that because of different reasons, but you're still open to that. So, what is it that you're really looking for in different edtech businesses that will make you invest into them?
Yeah. So for me, it's very much, I mean, the edtech market, the education market has always been there, right? So you're not creating like a new market. Um, I think what's changing is sort of moving from like the offline to the online, right? So I think that's sort of what's changing. And so I think for me, it's very much about, so I invested in a corporate company and corporate learning, because it's not creating like a new budget, it's not creating a new market. There is an existing 370 billion market out there, right? Which is very fragmented and mostly offline. So it's much more about sort of a consolidation of the space into areas that matter, right? Because I think, like, say for example, my portfolio company sort of helps train and upskill people who are first time managers, right? So and what it means to be like a manager is very different maybe 10 years ago to what it is now, right? You're dealing with different challenges. How do you hire in this very competitive market? How do you bring on more diversity and inclusion? How do you manage a remote workforce, right? So I think for me, it's very much about sort of not creating a new market, but how do you actually serve a very offline, very fragmented market better? How do you sort of create a system on top of that organizes it in a better way? So I think like obviously COVID has sort of brought on changes of like how do schools act, what's the role of universities, and I think all of that is going to change, but I think it will take longer than I think obviously over COVID, everything was super accelerated in its sort of, in its transition for some of the structural things. But the growth of that has sort of been more normalized now that we're coming out of COVID, right? We're sort of moving. So it has brought on like a lot of change, but the rate of change now is slower than it has over like the last 2 years where everything was digital, right? So I'm looking into like mainly sort of models that, sort of moving from an offline inefficient market to like making it a more efficient online market. So it can be universities, right? So like how do you sort of create a more degree, right? Or I think that would be interesting. And then I think, sort of like the whole edutainment kind of children's edutainment space can also be like a really interesting space, right? I think what you see nowadays is a lot of people put their children in front of iPads and so on, right? And so children are growing up like being very digital. And so going away from just like the pure entertainment, but like making it edutainment, I think that could be an interesting space as well where we might be see more innovation in the future.
Got it. Since you spoke of the shift from offline to online market, are there any go-to-market strategies that you would want edtech companies to adopt to capture the right audience and have a good traction on a repeated basis?
Yeah. I think the key challenge for like a lot of at least B2B, ed tech companies, right, has been their LTV and has been their, average contract value, right? Like typically they capture such a small wallet share of the, like the organization, right? And I think it's really much about how do you sort of think beyond the L&D, right? Like how do you make it like an ecosystem that's relevant for your employees as a stakeholder as well, for the C-level as a stakeholder as well, right? I think everybody can agree that sort of like human resources is like one of the most important resources for like every company that wants to innovate, right? And I think a lot of companies need to innovate, a lot of old industries need to innovate, a lot of new industries that need to keep on innovating and so on. But I think it's really hard to see it from an organizational level right now, right? Like how do you manage your resources to have the skills to like continuously innovate? So I think the companies that are going to be able to sort of win in the space, or the companies that are able to sort of take it out of this is a priority for like the L&D division, right? Or this is an employee benefit, to moving it to this is a strategic thing for companies to overcome, right? So to make it like this is a C-level discussion, and this is something that has employees, stakeholders as well. I think, much of the training today is like, oh, you have to do this training and so on, right? It's like you have to do compliance training because you have to do it, right? But how do you actually create something that employees want to do because there's tangible benefit in that, right? So for me, it's very much about how do I sort of marry all of these different stakeholders that are in this organization and make this a must do in a way.
Got it. You also said that edutainment is a space that you will see growing. Do you also see a dent in the practical learning market where people are now shifting for making the courses more real world for you to fit into a career? Do you see that market blooming? Because a lot of people find it difficult to cope up in the job after having even done their MBAs, because the books that don't teach them the practical aspects of how things work.
Yeah. Yes and no, because I think a lot of things are just very hard to sort of teach in a, in a theoretical way, right? Like a lot of these things are just learning by doing. And yes, you can have like hyper specialized companies doing that. I think the problem is about the scalability of that business model, right? So we've looked into spaces as well. You're like, oh, this is a really interesting thing, and everybody needs to learn that. But then it's it's not really everybody, right? It's very different, like company by company and so on, right? And say, for example, the skills of being an investor and this fund is very different to how another fund is looking at investment, right? So it's very difficult for a company to say, I teach you about investment. That would be great if you can put it all together and you're like, this is everything you need to know if you do this course, so a lot of it is sort of learned by, experience, right? So I think one cannot underestimate sort of like the practical learning that comes with just having done things, for a long time. So, but I think what we need to do is sort of then see what is the most scalable, what is the same across all organizations, right? Take that and sort of, do that as sort of like in entertainment, corporate learning, right? I also like, this is also like a slightly controversial view, but I think in terms of pure online, it's extremely difficult. And I think one of the key challenges in corporate learning so far has been just low adoption rate, right? So I think the sort of next generation of this goes back to what I said earlier, right? Like why, as an employee, why do I need to do this, right? Like I have a job, I have friends, I have hobbies, I have a family, and so on, right? Like why do I need to do this? So I think there needs to be like a really strong incentives of why people would want to do this. And I think with many of these online players, they have not sort of really answered that question in a really good way, right? So which is why the adoption rates have been traditionally very low.
Got it. We'll just move to the last segment of the interview, which is a rapid fire round. So quickly, would like to ask you about the fund as to what check sizes do you offer, which sectors do you invest in, and at what stage do you come in?
Yeah, sure. So 10 million, 10 to 20 million euros, geography, Europe and Israel, software and consumer. And I mean, other people in the fund sort of cover other spaces. Yes, and then so spaces that I'm interested in right now, I'm looking a lot into future of work, and I'm looking a lot into the ESG space.
Got it. Speaking of ESG, how do you really measure impact?
Well, it's not a criteria that we measure from a fund, right? Like we're not an impact fund, right? Like we're a fund that's supposed to create returns for LPs. So impact is measured by what's the impact that you create for the clients, right? Which you can also rephrase as what's the ROI for the client, right? And that's how you measure impact.
Got it. And sometimes in ESG, the G factor goes missing on governance. How do you ensure, as a person on the board, that the governance standards are met between other investors and the founder as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You're right. It's like usually, when we look at ESG, it's usually like, E and S, right? So I think governance is, yeah, nothing is really addressed it yet because maybe it's quite an intangible, like sort of thing to address, right? Like maybe not something that, there are willing buyers for in a way already, right? So that's why it hasn't really sort of been addressed from a product, perspective. Obviously, from a governance perspective, I mean, we always like, yeah, this goes back to like fiduciary responsibility towards our LPs, right? So we always apply like the utmost governance when it comes to like our portfolio companies. But yeah, it's not really like, a topic that sort of that I've seen anything in from a product perspective.
Understood. And do you see gender diversity on the boards you are on, though?
Sorry, do I what?
Do you see gender diversity on the boards that you sit on?
Uh, I'm often the only woman who's actually on the board, or at least like the only like board director actually. Many times I'm actually the first woman and the only woman. I'm trying to think. So yes, so one of the boards I'm definitely the only woman, and on the board I'm also the only woman. We have somebody who sort of joins us as an advisor, but she's not. Actually, there's one board now where we have more women than men on the board. Flow. Um, but it's a
Okay.
fertility tracking app. So it started off as like, having a lot of men, and we sort of transitioned it over time to have more women as well because, this is a company that serves like 50 million women, right, on a monthly basis. So we sort of, I think it made a lot of sense to kind of have more women on the board as well. And now we have more women than men on the board.
Since you invest in consumer sector, you might be knowing that women are the 85% of the decision makers when it comes to those products. But not having enough women on the board seat, how does it really change the dynamics of decision making?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because I think it comes with like a lot of what obviously helps if you are like the target audience is you have this sort of intuition of, what's the right thing to do, right? I think the way men usually approach it, they just run a lot of sort of small experiments and they run it like data science, right? They run it like a machine. And that also works. And that's great to sort of grow an existing business, but that's really hard to do sort of if you're trying to like break into something new, right? Then you need sort of intuition and like what are the things that we should be trying, and then you need methodology of like how you're trying it. But I think sort of from an idea generation and so on, right? It is obviously it makes sense if you sort of have people who are in that target audience, right? So yeah.
And do you allow interns to shadow anybody in your organizations from universities? Do you have their shadow internship program?
We don't really have a shadow program. We do have interns sometimes. I have an intern right now, for example. But these interns are, like I bring on interns who I want to become analysts for us, right? And so they are not shadowing in that sense. They are shadowing and in some of the conversations that we have and they're learning and so on. But it's not just one where you sort of go and you just look at what everybody else is doing, but they're doing, like I as soon as possible want to get them into, sort of becoming an analyst so that we can at the end of their internship hire them as an analyst as well.
Got it. On hiring, what's your hiring strategy? What kind of pedigree do you look for in the students who apply to you?
I wanted to have them work in. They should have some I mean, it depends on like what level we're hiring them in, right? So obviously, sort of, I've hired people straight out of university, and I've hired people sort of from, who are like more experienced as well, right? But typically, what I would want is I want people who have sort of showed that they're really hungry. Again, this is an industry where you will the feedback cycle is really long. You will only know very later on if you're good or not, right? And so I want people to really be hungry and really want it and really sort of pushing, right? I want people with a high level of emotional intelligence who are able to connect with other people, and people who always question everything, who sort of are really deep in their way of thinking, right? I think that's a problem. Sometimes people are like, oh, they look at a company superficially, this is a good company, right? But it's at a point of where we don't really have so much information, right? Because companies are early. I do want people to sort of think deeper about things, right? So it's more about that. It's sort of less about the background. And I want to have people who have worked in a competitive field or in a competitive sort of fast growth organization before, because that sort of prepares them also for the pace at which you're working as an investor.
Yeah. With that, we come to the end of the interview. But thanks a lot for your time and insights. Thoroughly enjoyed
Yeah,
your review, and I'm sure that people who will be listening to this will get a lot out of it.
yeah, amazing.